Hi, everyone. This is Emily Silverman, the creator and host of the Internist podcast, and I am posting this episode to say thank you for listening to season 2 of our show and to announce that we're already cooking up plans for season 3, so stay tuned for that. Also to announce that we're in the process of sifting through the entries for our first ever storytelling contest on the theme of learning, and we plan to announce the winner before the end of the month, so look out for that. And then also to post this episode, which is a special off-season episode, which was born several weeks ago when I got an email from some of the students at UCSF about their AOA Gold-Headed Cane lecture. This is a lecture where the students at UCSF get the chance to invite a physician they admire to come and give a talk. And this year, they chose to honor the wonderful Dr. Lucy Kalanithi from Stanford University. And I was lucky enough to be invited to be in conversation with her in the style of a fireside chat. You'll hear more about Lucy and her amazing accomplishments in the introduction that follows. But we had a wonderful conversation which touched on themes of the human body, space and time, illness and identity, prognosis, uncertainty, what it means to love your doctor or love your patient, the importance of community, physician burnout, and so much more. It's a conversation I've been thinking about ever since, and I figured, why not release it as a special episode of The Nocturnist? So here it is. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
Thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to introduce you all to this year's guest for the AOA Gold-Headed Cane Lecture, Dr. Lucy Kalanithi. So Dr. Kalanithi is an internist on faculty at the Stanford School of Medicine and an advocate for culture change around end-of-life care. She's a graduate of the Yale School of Medicine and the UCSF Internal Medicine Residency Program, and is a fellow of the American College of Physicians, a member of the AOA National Medical Honor Society, and an honoree of Mass General Cancer Center's The 100. She has implemented novel healthcare delivery models across primary care, hospitals, and health systems, including as a postdoctoral fellow in healthcare delivery innovation at Stanford's Clinical Excellence Research Center. She serves on leadership boards for TED-Med, the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care, and the American College of Physicians. Dr. Kalanithi's husband, the late Dr. Paul Kalanithi, was the author of the New York Times #1 best-selling memoir, When Breath Becomes Air. Together, Drs. Paul and Lucy Kalanithi inspire us to rethink how we approach suffering, death, and life, and we're so excited to continue these conversations today. Dr. Kalanithi is joined today by Dr. Emily Silverman, an academic hospitalist at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. Dr. Silverman is the host and creator of The Nocturnist, a medical storytelling event and podcast, and is a writer who seeks out projects that resurrect the narrative soul of medicine. She has published poems in the Examine Life Journal at the University of Iowa School of Medicine and has embarked on some exciting new writing projects with the support of a fellowship at the McDowell Colony. Her writing is animated by a deep-seated curiosity about science, human nature, and what it means to live and die well. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lucy Kalanithi and Dr. Emily Silverman.
Well, I'm so excited to be here with you. We've met a couple of times, but I've just always wanted to sit down and talk to you at length, like over coffee or over dinner, and I feel like this is a pretty good surrogate for that. I wish we could do, as we were joking earlier, for 3 hours instead of 30 minutes, but thank you so much for inviting me, all of you, to come and moderate this discussion with the amazing Dr. Lucy Kalanithi, and congratulations to all of you for being just a couple of weeks, some of you, from graduation, so yay. So maybe, Lucy, I'll just hand the mic over to you because I know you wanted to maybe open with a reading from Paul's book.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning of Paul's writing in this book. And it's so immensely meaningful to be here. I was a medicine resident through 2010, and I was excited to see that Panda Express has not gone anywhere. speaking of important institutions in medicine. Congratulations and thanks for having me. It's really an honor and meaningful. So this is just a kind of setting the tone for what happened to my late husband, who at the time of diagnosis of stage 4 lung cancer was a senior resident, rising chief resident in neurosurgery at Stanford. I flipped through the CT scan images, the diagnosis obvious. The lungs were matted with innumerable tumors, the spine deformed, a full lobe of the liver obliterated. Cancer, widely disseminated. I was a neurosurgical resident entering my final year of training. Over the last 6 years, I'd examined scores of such scans on the off chance that some procedure might benefit the patient. But this scan was different. It was my own. I received the plastic arm bracelet all patients wear, put on the familiar light blue hospital gown, walked past the nurses I knew by name, and was checked into a room. The same room where I had seen hundreds of patients over the years. In this room, I had sat with patients and explained terminal diagnoses and complex operations. In this room, I had congratulated patients on being cured of a disease. In this room, I had pronounced patients dead. I had sat in the chairs, washed my hands in the sink, scrawled instructions on the marker board, changed the calendar. I had even, in moments of utter exhaustion, longed to lie down in this bed and sleep. Now I lay there, wide awake. A young nurse, one I hadn't met, poked her head in. The doctor will be in soon. And with that, the future I had imagined, the one just about to be realized, the culmination of decades of striving, evaporated.
Thank you for that beautiful reading. I think that moment where almost like moving through the looking glass in Alice in Wonderland, going from doctor to being patient is such a powerful one. And you've talked a lot in your talks and interviews about the process of reshaping identity that goes on when we are faced with a new illness. And this is something I've been thinking a lot as well in the past couple of years, having gone through a health issue myself and being in physical pain for a year, which really limited my ability to do certain activities that I used to be able to do. And then kind of unexpectedly going through this like identity crisis of, well, if I'm not the girl or the woman or the person who used to be able to do those things, then now who am I? And then, of course, being faced with a terminal diagnosis, that process is just dramatically heightened. And then to be further a physician, and I think all of us as physicians or almost physicians tend to be very ambitious and future-oriented. There's just so much change that happens when we get a diagnosis like that. And so I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit about that process of identity shifts.
Yeah, and I think this is an important recognition, like you just described. I think, so for Paul, that moment of diagnosis, obviously there's sort of the immediate recognition that you are confronting your own mortality, not at all in an intellectual way or with somebody else but yourself earlier than expected. But I was really surprised by how, in addition to the challenge of facing mortality, which I think is, one of the biggest things we all do, was that upheaval in identity. I think when he talked about my future evaporated, I sort of realized, how much of our current identities are actually tied up in a conception of our future selves, whether it's having a child or enduring arduous education or, whatever it might be, you have a concept of sort of what you're planning, even if it's not fully articulated to yourself. There's sort of a set of assumptions about you're living into a future. And so when that explodes, I think, you're the same person you were 5 minutes ago, but you're also someone totally different. And I think that can happen more slowly with, certain kinds of disability or with aging in general, just the sense of what it means to be an agent who is living in a fragile body. And then I think in his writing, Paul talks a lot about, when you receive a diagnosis, you sort of have to learn potentially a new relationship to time in the future, but also you do continue to live like days and minutes, and you have to make choices about who you will be and how you will live in a new way. And I think what I noticed with Paul, and we'll probably get to this too, is how fortifying it feels to have a sense of agency, to have a sense of what your purpose is, to be building a life that's true to who you are. And I think feeling as if that is lost in the context of illness, whether it's your planned 40 years as a neurosurgeon or, whatever it might be, I think to figure out how to put back together a sense of agency and purpose really is a big deal. And I think that's something for us to explore with our patients. I think it's important for us to engage in that question. I was going to say one other thing. Oh yeah, I just think that thing you just said is really interesting too, about like what it meant when your body was in pain. Because I think especially when you're young, like except for ways in which like your body is, like pleasurable or allows you to explore the world through things like exercise or even sex or whatever. Like oftentimes you think about your body in those contexts when you're noticing it, but when we move through the world so easily, it's sometimes you don't think a lot about how you yourself are embodied. And I think with disability or illness, you think a lot about how your body takes up space and what your body looks like to other people. And I think there's different ways that we all do that, but kind of to varying degrees. It's like you get a sense of your own embodiment. And I think that's a helpful thing for us all to contemplate too, whether we have felt that ourselves or, think about it for our patients.
I like that we're talking so much about space and time right now, because I watched this beautiful lecture with Professor Rita Sharon from Columbia University, who coined the term narrative medicine almost a decade ago or over a decade ago. And in this talk, she described, how do we define the body? And her definition was, it is our GPS. It is our physical location. It is simply just the place where we are and where we live, and then thinking about that place as a space. That is a space in and of itself, and it takes up space and it moves through time. And I was really struck by some of the comments that I've heard you make about the body moving through time or the self moving through time, and how, as Paul was nearing the end of his life, time stopped feeling so much linear and felt more like a space to inhabit. And I have also heard you say that in your conversations with people who are aging or elderly or reaching their end of their life, that they've experienced a similar phenomenon where they start to experience time in this way. And so I was just wondering if you had any more thoughts to share about that piece of it and this idea of changing our relationship with time. And I suspect that there may be some relationship between this new perspective and then how we engage with mindfulness and the concept of like, how do we live in the moment and be present while also, keeping our goals and our future, the hope of our future, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be in good health.
Yeah, I think I can reflect on this personally. I think, when you are quite certain that you do not have a lot of time left, it is a different thing, right? It feels less linear or less like you are on a path to progress, and instead more like you are inhabiting a moment, in part because that moment may be like much of what you have. And I think that's part of like what people are asking when they are asking about prognosis, right? Like, how long have I got left? I think embedded in that question is like, who am I still? What do I still have? What can I expect to participate in and be? But at the same time, I'm going to go down a different path. I guess I'll just comment on the mindfulness thing. Like, in a way, it's great, right? It is not a, like, at least moment, of like, oh, isn't it so great? You've received the gift of, illness to bring this piercing clarity. But instead, I think to me, it did feel like sort of implicit in living with someone who's very ill and recognizing that time is short. We had a baby during the time that Paul was sick. And I think when you have a little baby, I might have wished away that time a little bit. Like, I can't wait till she sleeps through the night, or isn't it going to be so fun when she's talking, or like, what's the deal with her going to college? It's like you have all this future projection. But I think when you're so focused on the moment, I think it made me like really engage in what it meant to be a very new parent in a way that was different, because like that was the parenthood that I was going to share with Paul. So it felt sort of acutely heightened and meaningful in a way that was nice, you know? So I think that's right. And then there is like data on mindfulness as a healthy thing, you know, to like embodiment is part of that, right? Like you're washing your hands and you're like, this is the cool water going across my hands. Like it brings you into a sense of like what an important moment each of our moments is. And it's like actually good for your brain to do that, you know? Yeah.
And I think what you're saying about what someone really is asking when they say, how much time do I have left, is more, you know, what can I expect, or who am I? And that makes me think a lot about, as a physician, our role and our responsibility, and kind of just this conception of what it means to doctor. And we had talked a little bit over email about just different frameworks for the role of the doctor. And, you know, one concept is like just a transactional concept, like I need this treatment, you prescribe me the treatment. And it reminded me of a friend of mine who was recently diagnosed with lymphoma, and there was a little bit of ambiguity about what the pathology showed, and they went to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, you know, as long as it's classical Hodgkin's, we'll do chemo XYZ. If it's this other variant, then we'll do something else. And then they got called with the final word over the phone, and then showed up to start the chemo at an infusion center where the doctor wasn't present, had the first cycle, had the side effects, managed it, went back, had another cycle, and then realized, like, wow, we saw a doctor once for 15 minutes. And I just was talking to them about that. It almost brought tears to my eyes, the fact that, you know, that relationship hadn't really been sustained more than that, and just really made me think of something I've heard you talk about, which is this concept of physician as shepherd, and how, you know, even if logistically there isn't a reason to go back into the clinic because there's no change to the plan, what about just the concept of checking in? How are you doing? What can I expect? Who am I? Things like that. And so setting expectations, and also how to manage uncertainty, because you've also talked about how uncertainty, there's a physical pain of disease, but then there's this other existential pain, which is just the pain of uncertainty. So just curious how you think about the role of the doctor, and like, what is our job really?
Yeah. And I think this depends, right, on like the acuity or severity of the illness, and like, but one thing that surprised me when Paul became sick was how emotionally dependent it seemed he was on his oncologist. It was almost like he fell in love with his oncologist, like not in a weird way, but like in a like, just like even the way he looked at her, it was just like, please give me some bearings, you know? And I think that's something we can do, right? Like if we have not experienced an illness ourselves, we have seen the landscape and the way other people traverse it and what there might be to expect. I think like tied up in this question is prognostication, right? Like if somebody is asking you for information about what to expect, it involves potentially more than 15 minutes, right? Like to be able to give somebody a sense. I'm just going to go off on a prognostication, like side note, if that's okay. Because I think about this a lot and what was helpful for Paul. And I think that is tied up in this question of like, what is our role? How much information do people want? How much can we give? And being here at UCSF, I remember so well sort of the palliative care giants who are here, who I really admire. And I think part of our job is a nod toward like the existential and experiential aspects of illness. And included in that is like what is likely to happen, and then helping somebody navigate through what that means. So in our family, you know, it's interesting for people who've read Paul's book. Paul, when he was diagnosed, was pretty focused on grappling with the fact that he would likely die soon. And even stage 4 lung cancer, there's a really shifting disease course. You know, there are patients living for 7 years, 10 years, maybe longer than that. We don't know yet with these novel therapies. But he, like, you know, the mean is probably still around 2 to 3 years, depending on the type. And he lived 22 months. And so his oncologist didn't address prognosis a lot, but we kind of knew that the range was likely months to a few years. And in that range, which is sort of all you can give, Paul wrote about how it's irresponsible to be more precise than you can be accurate. The range of months to a few years being most likely is enough to help you decide how you might want to spend that time. Do you want to have a baby during that time? What will that mean for your family, et cetera? And I was going to say one other thing. Oh, yeah, like the role of a clinician or a physician. I think that role of sort of like being a guide or being somebody who's there, like willing to talk about what's happening, doesn't go away when you no longer have a clear medical treatment to offer, or a surgical treatment. There's this really beautiful essay by the palliative care physician Diane Meyer called something like, "I didn't want Jenny to think I was abandoning her." And it's so beautiful. It's about this Diane Meyer, the palliative care physician, treating a patient with really advanced breast cancer and brain mets or leptomeningeal disease or, advanced neurologic disease related to the cancer. And she calls the oncologist and says, "I see that you're planning intrathecal chemo, which is kind of a big deal. And do you think it's actually going to work?" And the oncologist says, "No, it's really definitely probably not, but I don't want her to think I'm abandoning her." And then this interesting thing happens where the patient ends up getting really sick and going on to hospice at home, and then is actually sad that the oncologist doesn't call, because what she's hoping for from the oncologist is actually like that connection between them. And she still thinks of him as her oncologist and the one that she's in love with, regardless of whether the intrathecal chemo is going to work, or maybe even regardless of whether it's given. So I don't know. I think about that a lot too. I just was so surprised by, in our family, like, you anticipate this appointment, you go to the appointment, you listen to like everything that's said, you go home and parse it. Like, what did she mean when she said this and what's this? And it's like, no pressure for any of us, but it's like, it really like, it's just really powerful. And even the way that we say things to patients matter. There's this really interesting study that was done at Stanford pretty recently investigating what it meant in terms of actual patient outcomes when a physician was competent and warm. And those were like the two things they varied, like the seeming competence of the physician, however that was derived in the study, and warmth, like were you leaning toward the patient, how are you speaking? And they injected some kind of like histamine to create a wheel and then applied an inert placebo cream on top of it. But the physician said something like, "This should get better like quite quickly. This cream is going to help." And depending on whether competence and warmth were both present, the rash went away more quickly. Just so interesting. I'm sure that only works with like certain things, right? Neuroendocrine stuff or whatever, but who knows? I think it's such an interesting portrayal of like, we ourselves are the medicine, and I think that matters.
There's so many different ways that I would love to go with that, but maybe I'll start just because we've been talking a lot about the body, like the physical object of the body and the way that it responds, not just to chemicals, but also to connection. And you've talked a lot about the tingling in your hands that you felt after Paul died and how you worried you had this neurological disease, and you discovered that it was the grief manifesting physically. And also thinking about a friend of mine who's a pediatric oncologist and how when they're putting an IV in a child's hand, she says sometimes they'll do this thing where they'll go like this and they'll say, "Okay, now I'm putting a glove of numbness on your hand." And then they put the IV, and she's like, "It really works." It's almost like a form of hypnotism or just some psychological placebo effect. But I find that piece of what you're describing really interesting. The language we use, the visual guided imagery, all of these things can have a lot of healing potential or palliative potential. And I think sometimes aren't acknowledged or are even discounted in Western medicine. And then the other place, and you can choose which you want to pick up, is this idea of falling in love with your doctor in a way that's really focused more on connection and this idea of like love embodied in medicine and what it means to doctor as an act of love. And I've also heard you describe the process of filling out an advance directive, an act of love, and you compare it to signing a marriage certificate, that when you as a family member sign your advance directive, it's a promise that if something happens, I will be there for you, I will speak for you. And I just thought that was so beautiful, and I wonder if you've ever framed it to patients and families that way. So those are just a couple thoughts if you want to pick up wherever.
Yeah. I have framed it more that way in like public speaking than like individually, partly because my job doesn't currently involve like, I used to do primary care and I'm not currently, so I used to do a lot of advanced directives and now less so. And advanced directives are really interesting, right? Like, I think, so Paul was able to speak for himself through the end of his life and carry out medical decision-making on his own behalf, although like in concert with physicians and like a lot of like forehead to forehead conversations with me, it was kind of thorny, like whether to be intubated, while dying of terminal cancer. And he decided not to be, but it was weirdly hard to figure out maybe he could come off the ventilator and go home or write more or spend more time. It was, even as physicians, it was really hard to like figure out what was most likely with the information that we had. And I think it's easy when someone dies to feel a lot of uncertainty or guilt or what if, was I enough? And I think the way those decisions get made at the end of life and participating in those things as participating in those things in a deep way, like can carry you through the ocean of grief, or provide some trauma, if you witnessed your loved one receiving medical care that they wouldn't have wanted or whatever. And at the same time, I think like all you can do is do your best, and everybody always did their best. But I think it matters. I think, this is part of why I think we ourselves feel moral distress about the cultural norms around end-of-life care in the U.S., And then I think advance directives are tricky a little bit because I've called them an act of love. Like you're signing up to be there, and C, and B, like represent somebody, talk for them. If they can't speak for themselves, like you're the voice of what they would say if they could say something. And I continue to feel that way for Paul, but at the same time, it's partly like a flimsy document, right? Like it came out of a patient autonomy movement where the Supreme Court decided that we have the right to refuse medical care. It's just sort of like, duh, like that's important. And then the next thing was we have the right to designate somebody who could refuse medical care for us. So that's important too. And that's what an advance directive is. It's like, who can speak for you? And is it okay for them to refuse care? Yes, yes. But at the same time, it doesn't give you a lot of information about like who the person really is. It's more like a checkbox that gives you a right. And so I think the really important thing is like having somebody who knows you really well, who can help navigate complexity by speaking to who you are in the setting of complexity, which we can't know as physicians. And then there's just like when I go to a wedding now, I used to think like weddings were so romantic and they kiss and it's so romantic. And now I'm like, that one line of in sickness and in health is like really romantic. It's really brave to sign up to love somebody through all of this because, best case scenario, like these are decisions we'll make. And I do think it's really beautiful.
What you're saying just reminds me about the social ties that bind us, whether it's a partner or just friends, family, community, and community being something I've been thinking a lot about as well. And when I've heard you speak, I've heard you talk about this and about how as you moved through your grief, there are many things that you did for self-care and continue to do, including exercise, sleep, and social connection. And you say that Paul once said, everybody has to take care of Lucy so that Lucy can take care of me. And I thought that was such a perfect way to sum up the importance of having that network and that support system and how none of us should really be moving through this alone. And I think in 2019, it feels to me sort of hard to have a community sometimes, especially medical folks. Like we're matching and moving to this city and that institution far away from our families. Maybe a computer tells us we're moving to a place where we don't know anyone. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on like, how do we build community, because community is almost like an insurance policy against uncertainty and loneliness.
Yeah. Yeah. And like Vivek Murthy, who was Obama's Surgeon General, like one of his things that he focused on as a public health problem was loneliness specifically, which is so interesting. It's like he did opioids too, but like obesity, smoking, like loneliness, naming it as a public health problem was like really surprising and powerful. Yes, I totally agree with this. I think about like two pieces of this. One is like the writer Jason Green describes this idea of first responder friends. Like that is the insurance policy, right? Like who's going to rush in and lift you up? It matters. Like those connections hold you. And at the same time, like what are the structural pieces of that too? Like I think it is still the hardest thing in your life if you go through a really intensive loss or illness in your family, even if you have insurance and financial resources and a compassionate boss and paid leave or a held job, you know, like what are the other layers of like community and how we hold each other up policy wise. And then, oh darn, I was going to say something about this. Oh yeah. I was just going to say, I wanted to call out your work with the nocturnists because there's like the physician piece of it, right? Too, is like when burnout is studied, like the system factors that separate us from each other, like working along our computers or not having opportunities to connect professionally and build our own relationships to blow off steam or speak to people who speak our language. You know, I think especially when you're a resident, like those bonds are really powerful and people in this room are about to go develop those. It's like anybody who I was a resident with 10 years ago, like I could throw up on their shoes and they would be like completely fine with it. I mean, I just feel like it's really powerful to have somebody to share that vulnerability with, including professionally. And you guys all have it now, I'm sure, with your friends. Yeah. And then I think a lot about like tied up in this question of loneliness and community, right, is like how much can you share your vulnerability? And I went through an episode of depression as a medical resident here and like talked to my program director about it and ended up taking 2 weeks off and secretly was like very terrified that it was going to ruin my career. Like you fill out your hospital credentialing later and you have to say like, are you able to take care of patients? It's like the answer is yes. Like I asked for help. I figured it out. I took some time, you know, but I think there's becoming less and less of a stigma about speaking about our own vulnerability, whether it's mental health, and recognizing. And I, by the way, if you had told me then that I would like sit in cold hall and like say that out loud in front of like Dr. Lucy, you know, and like Dr. Hauer, it's like, I'd be like, what? So, you know, I think it's incumbent on us as we rise to leadership to like figure out how to make that possible. And I think like the burnout question, which I know we wanted to mention, I think if you feel like you are burning out, like you are feeling depersonalized in healthcare or feeling emotionally exhausted or feeling less efficacious because of fatigue or whatever, it's not that something's wrong with you. It used to be like, this is a personal resilience problem, you know, and it was seen as like, you know, we need to do yoga and meditation. And I think the idea now is more something along the lines of if there's a canary in the coal mine, you can just tell the canary to meditate. And that's like really a big deal. And I think, so I think thinking about systemic aspects of burnout and culture change is immensely important.
And just flag me down when we're running out of time because I could just talk forever. But I think those are all really great points. And you talk a lot about the distress I think that sometimes health providers experience taking care of patients, but especially taking care of patients in situations that just you want to find hope, and sometimes it's hard to. I do my clinical work at San Francisco General Hospital, where a lot of my patients just have really like tough stories, lots of trauma. A lot of them don't have a social network at all. Like one of the first questions I ask my patients is, who would you like me to call in case of an emergency? And it still breaks my heart every single time when it's met with silence. and you were kind enough to say a word about my work. And I think one thing that I'm trying to do with my work is find the meaning in the suffering. But I've also, I recently read this interesting piece about a man who's a ghostwriter at a religious publication who looks for people's stories about how God has intervened in their life, and then he kind of repurposes them and writes them for this religious magazine. And the piece is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but he says, sometimes I feel like I'm just a line worker at the Epiphany plant. And I'm thinking like, oh God, is the Nocturnist an epiphany plant? And so I wonder sometimes, like, does everything have to have an epiphany? Does suffering always have to have meaning or a silver lining or a lesson or a takeaway, or is suffering ever just suffering and that's it? And if that's the case, what do we do with that? Meditation, among other things.
Yeah, so the answer to what we do about it, like, I really don't know. I think about this a lot too. I'm sure people in this room do. I think not all suffering has a meaning. I think that's really clear. And in that case, sometimes all we can do is sit with it and figure out how to tolerate it and sit with each other in it. You know, if there's any meaning in suffering, any common meaning, it's like it connects us to all other people in the world, right? Because suffering is everywhere. I think sometimes suffering does have a meaning. It's sort of up to us at times, right? And for me, that's been true. But at the same time, if there's a meaning to something, it's not on us to decide for other people, like whether there is or what it is. And it also takes a lot of time, potentially, right? Like, it's not as simple as like, I will pull myself up from depression by like bootstraps I have made of gratitude. You know, it's like, I think Krista Tippett talks about how she went through, she's like this theologian who runs the On Being Project, and she talks with people about all kinds of like spiritual things and meaning in their lives. She has this really beautiful podcast and called On Being. And she has talked, she's now probably like in her 50s. She's talked about how when she was in her 30s, she had really severe depression, and that in the 20 years since, she's come to realize that like her own touching of this darkness made her able to do the work she can do now and ask the questions she can do now. But at the time, if you had told her that or suggested that, it would have made like no sense. And it would never have been possible to like grok that at the time for a long time. And so I think the idea of like packaging suffering into like a shiny object in the factory or like a set of accomplishments or something is like not the way to think about it. While at the same time, we grow from trauma. So it's both. And then I think there's the other thing, which is like, depends what kind of suffering, right? Like, is it the suffering that we can fix and alleviate? And we should, like social injustices, or is it something that we can't fix? And sitting with it is the answer. There's a really beautiful essay about this by Adi Barkan, who is a young active social justice activist who's really powerful, who also is dying of ALS at the moment. And he testified last week in Congress for Medicare for All in a wheelchair using his eyes to speak through eye gaze technology. And he wrote an essay in The Nation about acceptance versus resistance, and like what kinds of problems do you choose resistance and what do you choose acceptance for, and when do you have to choose both at the same time, and what does that feel like? And it's really powerful. I think that's sort of one of the things I'm thinking about now. You know, and it's a question for us as physicians too. I know the people who come to this school and the mission of this institution includes leadership in the world to alleviate suffering. And I think that's exciting. And that's part of like when you have MD after your name, you can speak with gravitas right away in a way that people listen to on that stuff.
I think that's really inspiring because maybe, you know, when I'm sitting with my patient and it's today and maybe all I can do today is accept, I can still hopefully create some change in the world so that the next wave of people don't have to, you know, ideally go through the same sort of suffering. And I think that's what you all will do as you graduate and move on in your careers, is just incrementally, hopefully, make the world and make healthcare a better place. So I think that's a really nice note to end on. So I just want to thank Lucy so much for your wisdom and your brilliance and your kindness. And it's just such an utter joy to meet you. So thank you. That was the very wise Lucy Kalanithi. I'm really grateful to Lucy and the UCSF School of Medicine for allowing me to air that interview as a special episode of The Nocturnist. Please let us know if you enjoyed listening, because we're continuing to experiment with these different episode types. I also want to let you know that Lucy has some new exciting creative projects brewing. So I highly recommend following her on Twitter at RocketGirlMD. That's at RocketGirlMD, and you'll be the first to know when she releases new work. That's all for now. I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnist. Take care.